I have only that one slide. It's a photograph of Jim Garrison taken by Life magazine for what was to have been a Life magazine cover. It was never used. I wanted you to see his face because there are few figures in American history who have been more maligned than Jim Garrison, by government agencies, their representatives, by the major media. In the 1990s, these attacks were reflected in the reactions of an astonished Oliver Stone, who called Jim Garrison's publisher to ask, "Why didn't you tell me that so many people hated Jim Garrison?" The real-life Jim Garrison was nothing like the character played by Kevin Costner in Stone's courageous movie, JFK. Garrison was brilliant, invariably ironic, with a sharp, sardonic sense of humor, bawdy, bookish, very tall, and dark-haired. New Orleans scoffed at Costner's Mississippi accent. Garrison was born in Iowa, grew up in New Orleans. He did not suffer fools gladly. Yet, were it not for Oliver Stone and his effective lobbying for the release of the government's JFK records, Jim Garrison's case could not be substantiated as it can today. We would not know, had that small portion of the Church Committee records now available not emerged, that Lee Oswald worked not only with FBI and CIA, but also with a third agency, with U.S. Customs in New Orleans. This was corroborated by a Cuban FBI informant named Horace Pena, whose name is probably familiar to many people here, and who observed Oswald in the presence of customs agents on a regular basis. Pena's FBI files were systematically destroyed in the 1970s in a variety of European cities. At least one directive has survived. Rome file regarding Orestes Pena, IS-Cuba destroyed. The INS people corroborated all this in testimony before the Church Committee. Their actual testimony remains under lock and key. One of the New Orleans police officers who attempted to subvert Garrison's investigation was Edward O'Donnell. O'Donnell was himself an agent of United States Customs. That document is available. During the Garrison investigation, O'Donnell admitted that he was unable to obtain a polygraph reading and insisted falsely that witness Perry Rousseau had retracted his testimony and that Rousseau had declared that he had not seen Clay Shaw. That wasn't true. We would not know that the one Marine Corps cohort of Oswald who told the Warren Commission that Oswald was a Marxist was trained in Washington himself in biological and chemical warfare by the CIA. His name was Kerry Thornley. We would not know that the first source who described the relationship between Oswald and a CIA contract pilot named David Ferry had himself been a CIA employee. His name was Jack Martin, and his agency employment continued throughout 1963. Like Ferry, Martin was from Cleveland. Those documents became available in the final CIA releases to the National Archives in 2002. We would not know that the Fair Play for Cuba, for which Oswald was supposedly distributing leaflets, did you notice that Senator Specter referred to that this morning, had been infiltrated by, quote, appropriate cutouts of the CIA, hoping to plant, quote, deceptive information to embarrass that organization. This infiltration was a project supervised by CIA propaganda specialist David Atlee Phillips, who, as you all know, was the handler of militant Cuban exile Antonio Veciana, and as you know, Gayton Fonzie pretty much established that the Maurice Bishop, whom Veciana knew, was Phillips. So Garrison, as we go through and look at all this evidence, was very close to being 100% correct as he began his investigation in 1966 when he said that Oswald was not with anybody during that time who was not with CIA. And by that time he meant, of course, the summer of 1963 from April through September. Nor would we have in writing that the FBI was so frightened by Jim Garrison's investigation that J. Edgar Hoover sent an urgent directive instructing all FBI personnel, quote, tell Garrison nothing. The young assistants and police officers attached to the district attorney's office were shocked that a cognate law enforcement agency, the FBI, refused to cooperate with them and was in fact deliberately sabotaging their efforts. 35 years later, when I described that document to Lou Ivon, Garrison's chief investigator, he remarked, I'd like to see that. They were really innocents, and with a T, not with a C, down there in New Orleans. And I might have said this morning as well that when Garrison issued a material witness warrant for Gordon Novell to come and testify before the grand jury. He wanted a federal warrant as well for unlawful flight, and he requested this from Louis LaCour, who was the United States Attorney. LaCour asked the Department of Justice in Washington whether he should do it. They said no, and of course it never happened. A few words about Jim Garrison. He was a Reformed Democrat who modeled his office on that of Frank Hogan in New York County, for which Bob Tannenbaum worked, except for one thing: Jim Garrison would never have prosecuted Lenny Bruce. He was a First Amendment absolutist and refused to prosecute a bookstore for selling James Baldwin's Another Country. The zealots had to go to the city attorney to get that case into court. Garrison also refused to prosecute crimes against nature, sexual crimes, except when the defendant was a priest, accustomed to receiving a slap on the wrist from the Catholic judges of the criminal court. Garrison's ambition had been to be a novelist, and after graduating from the Tulane School of Law, he took 6 months off to write stories. He sent them to a New York literary agent who wrote his stories were, quote, decidedly promising. He wrote Garrison, give your work your best efforts, please. I believe you will hit the mark in not too long a time. Garrison wrote an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew and sent it to WDSU-TV, which, for those who know the case, know were his arch enemies later, for its live drama, Theater 6. It was not taken. Garrison was penniless and gave up writing for the moment, abandoning as well the idea of becoming a professor of law. He had received a master's degree in civil law. He opted to go into practice. Be anything but a lawyer, he told his son Jasper years later. Garrison's greatest satisfaction would come from the 3 books he eventually published, one a novel, The Star-Spangled Contract. Do you mind if I tell something slightly bawdy, maybe? Jim Garrison was not particularly impressed by the President of the United States. Right after Garrison's own election in 1962, he went to Washington because his mentor, former New Orleans Mayor Chet Morrison, now head of the Organization of American States, wanted to introduce him to President John F. Kennedy. Accompanying Garrison on the trip was his girlfriend. On Saturday night, Garrison was up so late that he overslept and failed to appear at the breakfast arranged for him to meet the president. Hearing the story, his best friend in New Orleans was incredulous. You can always meet a president, Garrison told him, but you can't always get a piece of ass like that. I met Garrison in May of 1969, and you would not have known that he had lost his case against Clay Shaw the previous March. You would not know he was running for re-election. He talked only about the case which remained alive for him. A few years later, the Department of Justice sent a task force to Louisiana ostensibly to investigate organized crime. In fact, they wanted only to put Garrison in jail. And when they failed to do that, they packed up and left town. Suddenly, organized crime had ceased to exist in Louisiana. The one witness against Garrison was his former chief investigator, Pershing Gervais, whose name appears on the CIA's top secret list of plants in Garrison's office. And I know about that because some of the HSCA people were allowed to go into CIA headquarters and look at documents. They were not allowed to take notes or photocopy, and there was the list of plants in Garrison's office. You will not find that document today in the National Archives. Documents reveal that Walter Sheridan, the man who had come to New Orleans with the acquiescence of Robert Kennedy to destroy Garrison, made no secret of it. Sheridan had attempted to bribe several witnesses and blackmail Gervais personally. Sheridan told Gervais he would go to jail for 8 years for income tax evasion unless he testified against Garrison. Sheridan, as you also may know, was a veteran of the National Security Agency, the FBI, the CIA, and the Department of Justice, as well as working for the Kennedys. The IRS was his weapon. Gervais, who knew more about crime in Louisiana than anyone, recanted before Garrison's trial, and the bribes in question turned out to have been going to the chief of police in New Orleans, whose name was Joe Giarrusso. How did Garrison get started on this case? Not through Senator Russell Long. In March of 1965, Garrison was so popular that he decided to run for governor of Louisiana. Governor John McKiffin, whom Garrison had been instrumental in putting into office, could not by law succeed himself. And I think people joked and they said that finally McKiffin was able to do what Huey Long and Earl Long couldn't do, and that is to throw out that law. Anyway, Garrison was all set to run. He issued a press release, and while he addressed a convention of dentists in Baton Rouge, an assistant distributed the press release announcing his candidacy to all the radio stations. On the way home, Garrison stopped at a newsstand and bought Esquire magazine, which contained an article on the Warren Report by Dwight MacDonald. MacDonald called the commission's efforts an exorcism rather than an attempt to find the truth, and wondered how the FBI and CIA involvement in the assassination came in motive-wise. Noting that officials of a feather stick together, MacDonald lamented that neither Sherlock Holmes nor Earl Stanley Gardner had been available. He concluded that there had been no investigation at all. At the end of the month, Garrison was in Washington, D.C., and met with Louisiana Representative Hale Boggs. Boggs confided that during the closed January 22nd session of the committee, the rumor that Oswald had been on the payroll of the FBI was debated, and we have those records thanks to the late Harold Weisberg, to whom we should pay some tribute, and also to Professor Rohn, who is here with us today. It was the combination of what Boggs told him and the MacDonald article which led Garrison to undertake his investigation. In later years, Garrison said that it was Russell Long who encouraged him to investigate. All his life, Garrison protected his sources. Boggs was telling Warren Commission tales out of school. Long, after a week with Garrison, the famous airplane trip that we've read about, told his daughter that Garrison talked endlessly and with intensity about the assassination. He chewed my ear off, Long said. So Garrison was already well into his case. Governor McKiffin achieved his end and, of course, ran again. Garrison didn't care. Politics bored him. Oswald had resided in his jurisdiction from April to September of 1963, and so he began. Garrison had neither the government documents we have today nor the cooperation of witnesses who had critical information but were under the discipline of federal agencies or were too terrified at the time to come forward. One such witness was Lieutenant Francis Martello of the New Orleans Police, who interviewed Oswald after he was arrested for a shoving match on Canal Street with a Cuban exile named Carlos Brinier. Valuable witnesses like the CIA's William Godet believe the entire fracas was staged by a right-wing anti-Castro propagandist named Edward Scannell Butler, himself a CIA asset, as the documents reveal. Martello talked about his conversation with Oswald for the first time in the 1990s. I have two witnesses who were present during his confession. Martello said that Oswald handed him a note, just like the note he handed them in the embassy in Moscow, pointed to a number and said, "Just call the FBI, tell them you have Lee Oswald in custody." When they arrive, Oswald directed Martello, "Hand them this note." He demanded that a particular FBI agent, Warren DeBruys, come down. The clerk who answered the telephone at the FBI, William Walter, is known to assassination researchers. Only one FBI agent was available, namely John Quigley, and it was Quigley who, with Oswald's FBI number in hand, directed Walter to search the office indices for records of Lee Oswald. This was August of 1963. Walter found 105 files on Lee Harvey Oswald relating to espionage and Cuba, as well as 134 informant files. There was also a security file related to Oswald hidden in the locked filing cabinet of the special agent in charge. This file was locked up for some security purpose, Walter knew. On the file jacket were two names, Lee Oswald, Warren DeBruys. After the Clayshaw trial, William Walter acknowledged to Garrison that the FBI was communicating with Oswald on a regular basis. The FBI made certain that Walter would not be available to testify. Warren DeBruys claimed to be attending a barbecue, and so Quigley went down to talk to Oswald. Like Dr. Humes, he claimed that he burned his notes. Martello stole Oswald's note and rendered a facsimile to the FBI, keeping the original in his personal possession until his death. Both from government documents and from subsequent witness testimony, it turns out that a host of suspects whom Jim Garrison questioned played a specific role in the implementation of the murder of President Kennedy. I shall name them. Somebody yesterday talked about, are we finally giving some names? Then explain what I discovered in the process of writing my book. The suspects were David Ferry, of course, Clayshaw, Thornley, Juan Valdez, Lawrence Howard, Thomas Edward Beckham. What all these people have in common is CIA involvement. And please note what I said this morning, that John Witten's statement that there was no difference between a CIA agent and an employee, and that there were high-level agents who were staff agents with staff status, but who were not quote-unquote employees. With the exception of Lawrence Howard, all knew Lee Oswald well. Ferry had died under at least suspicious circumstances by the time Garrison brought Shaw to trial. On the stand, of course, as you know, Shaw lied repeatedly. None of the other witnesses were available to testify, which was not Garrison's fault. Garrison's first suspect was Ferry, and I'll have to say a few words in order to come to the punchline of what I discovered about Ferry. He had questioned Ferry, as you know, on the Monday after the assassination, after Ferry had spent that weekend in Houston and Galveston. In November of 1963, Garrison had no desire to begin an investigation of the murder of the president, and he turned Ferry over to the FBI. Ferry then lied both to the Bureau and to the Secret Service. He said falsely that he had not been in Dallas, quote, for the last 8 to 10 years. He claimed that he did not remember Lee Oswald, although Oswald had been in the Civil Air Patrol under his direct tutelage. In fact, Ferry had kept in close contact with Oswald since his Civil Patrol days in 1955. A witness named Van Burns, who did not come forward for Garrison, describes an evening at Pontchartrain Beach in September of 1959, just before Oswald left for the Soviet Union and his arranged quote-unquote defection. Van Burns was a young man in charge of the parakeet stand at Pontchartrain Beach. He was a friend of one of Ferry's favorite CAP cadets, Bob Boylston. Ferry even paid his college tuition. One night, there was Bob Boylston in the company of David Ferry and a man introduced to Burns as Lee Oswald. He was in the Marine Corps, Oswald said, in recon. What did you do, Burns asked. We take pictures, Oswald said. In later years, of course, as you know, a score of these cadets have come forward. Ferry was confident that his friends would cover for him. During that third week of November 1963, in testimony which Garrison never received, Ferry walked into the Old Loyalty Bar wearing military camouflage, including vest and cap. "Why are you dressed like that?" a friend said. "We're going on a hunting trip to Texas," Ferry replied. "What are you hunting for?" Big game," Ferry proclaimed. On the day after the assassination, these friends at once concluded that David Ferry had been involved in the murder of the president. A few days after Ferry's return from Texas, he was still in hunting clothes. "Did you get any big game?" he was asked. Ferry laughed. "Damn right, you know it." This was not a confession that would hold up in court, but the evidence was accumulating that in David Ferry, mentor of Lee Oswald and CIA contract employee, Jim Garrison had a promising suspect. Having concluded that Clay Shaw was indubitably Bertrand, despite the problems with the Moran material, Garrison questioned Shaw only for Shaw to deny that he knew either Ferry, Oswald, or Dean Andrews. Garrison then exposed the key witness, and I'm just going to say a few words about Perry Russo, who placed Ferry and Bertrand together. Maybe I don't have to go, I think you all know about that testimony, so I won't go into all of it. Finally, the FBI and CIA, working closely together, sent an asset named James Phelan, doubling as a Saturday Evening Post reporter, to work on Russo. The established media cooperated amply with these FBI and CIA plans. Walter Sheridan had credentials as a producer for NBC and even produced an amateurish white paper. And I think later this afternoon, Judge Thunheim will tell you about how NBC has refused to give these papers over to the National Archives regarding Sheridan's role. Phelan's reports to the FBI, or some of them, are available. And Phelan would claim, as you probably know, that it was only under sodium pentothal that Russo said Clem Bertrand, Clay Shaw, had been at the gathering at Ferry's apartment. And a new piece of evidence that I have found is that Garrison had a police artist create a composite of Clem Bertrand based specifically upon Russo's description, which had nothing to do with sodium pentothal sessions. The artist produced a close likeness of Clay Shaw. That artist was a New Orleans police officer named Robert Burris, whose record of honesty and integrity has been unimpeachable, and whom you know as one of the members of Team 3 for the House Select Committee in Louisiana. Phelan's efforts to discredit Jim Garrison continued well after his death, when his papers passed into the hands of his niece, whose name is Patricia Lambert, and who wrote a scathing attack on Garrison in 1998. All right. Of the evidence I uncovered, one document stands out. It places David Ferry in Dallas the week of the assassination, and it connects Ferry directly to Clay Shaw. It establishes that Ferry was telling the truth when he told Lou Ivon, Garrison's chief investigator, that both he and Shaw were CIA operatives. Among the many CIA assets in New Orleans, and somebody said everybody in New Orleans somehow had connections to CIA, who did not come forward to help Jim Garrison, was a man named Herbert Wagner, a loan officer in Kenner, Louisiana. Wagner provided a statement to Garrison about David Ferry, how Ferry attempted to recruit him to participate in Operation Mongoose, the plot to kill Fidel Castro. Wagner never revealed the most important information that he had. His daughter told me that Wagner had been a CIA aviator for years. Like Ferry, he too had high rank in the Civil Air Patrol. Thomas Edward Beckham, a young runner for Guy Bannister, about whom more later, told the House Select Committee investigators that one day at the offices of G. Ray Gill, a lawyer in New Orleans, Gill instructed David Ferry to go and rent an airplane. Nothing more was said or why. One night, during Jim Garrison's investigation, a police officer in Kenner paid Herbert Wagner a casual visit. As they chatted, Wagner asked his friend whether he should tell something he knew to Jim Garrison. Then he reached into the back of a drawer in one of his filing cabinets. He pulled out a file. It was a loan application from David Ferry, who had long been one of his customers. This application, dated of November of 1963, was for $400 to rent an airplane. Some little backstory about that. Dave had taken Wagner to the New Orleans airport so that Wagner could make a collateral appraisal on the airplane Ferry owned. Does this plane have an airworthiness certificate? Wagner had asked, with the Germanic exactitude that led Ferry to nickname him Von Wagner. Wagner looked. He was not satisfied with the airworthiness of this 1948 Blue Stinson Voyager. He wanted, instead, a co-signer for the loan. Dave admitted he needed to rent the plane to fly to Dallas. It was the week of the assassination. He brought a most respectable co-signer for his loan. It was none other than the managing director of the International Trade Mart, Clay Shaw. The incident, never reported to Jim Garrison, establishes at the very least that Garrison's two chief suspects, Shaw and Ferry, had foreknowledge of the events in Dallas on that third week of November of 1963. And contrary to Shaw's lies, perjury is the word, I guess, they knew each other well. In the intervening years, others have confirmed that Ferry flew to Dallas that week. Witnesses include Alan Campbell, a young man who worked for Guy Bannister and who had a plane next to Ferry's at the airport, and a retired Louisiana State Trooper named Robert A. Gertner. Gertner reported to the FBI only in the mid-1980s that Ferry had flown to Dallas that week. He offered to take a polygraph were anyone interested. To this day, Clay Shaw's lawyers and Garrison's detractors insist that Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald did not travel together to Clinton and Jackson during the late summer of 1963, although during the Clay Shaw trial, Garrison put on witnesses, black and white, who said they saw them. Many said they saw Oswald stand on line with blacks during a core voter registration drive because he thought registering to vote in East Feliciana Parish would help him get a job at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson, a mental hospital. I think it's important to note that one of the witnesses explained that Oswald had no idea that this was a mental hospital. One of the East Feliciana witnesses, the state representative Reeves Morgan, telephoned the Bureau right after the assassination, declaring that he had seen Oswald up there. From Hoover directly down to the resident agent, the Bureau denied that they had ever received such a call. The FBI realized fully the implications of Clay Shaw's documented presence in Clinton in the company of Oswald and Ferry. It linked a key CIA asset with the accused assassin. The Bureau decided to deny that they had ever received the call. One of Garrison's assistants wrote to the resident agent in Baton Rouge. Meanwhile, the head people in the FBI's intelligence division, it's called Division 5, called the New Orleans field office with the order that everything must be denied. Two Garrison assistants went up to Baton Rouge. They were told that the resident agent was not in. These denials continued and included a memo from Hoover. By the way, the FBI ran the Department of Justice during this time. A memo from Hoover to the Attorney General in which Hoover denies that Reeves Morgan contacted the FBI. We made a thorough, by the way, this also leads to the idea of how carefully you have to look at the documents that we get from the National Archives. All right, we made a thorough review of our files at the time and found no record that Morgan had ever furnished this information to us. Our files contain no information that Oswald had ever been in these areas. Jim Garrison always believed that the truth would come out. No one was invisible. There was always someone under the oak tree, he said, quoting the writer William March. There was someone under the oak tree in this case. It was an employee of the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson who recounted that an FBI agent had visited the hospital on the Tuesday or Wednesday after the assassination. He wanted to know if Oswald had been at the hospital, an inconceivable question unless he already knew that Oswald had been in Clinton and Jackson. He is supposed to have turned in an application, the agent said, as indeed Oswald had done. And I think if we have time, we should talk about why Shaw took Oswald up to the insane asylum up there in Jackson and what that meant in relation to Oswald's being treated as a scapegoat for the assassination of President Kennedy. Those who insist that the Warren Commission was thorough might think of this witness who was never interviewed. The House Select Committee did not find her because the Louisiana team up in Clinton were not permitted to interview anyone whose name did not appear on a list that issued out of Washington, D.C. 40 years later, the FBI's Baton Rouge resident agent, still alive, talked to me. He said that shortly after the assassination, he was driving by the Clinton courthouse with one of his subordinates, Michael Barron, now deceased. That must be where that guy thought he saw Oswald, the man said, revealing and confirming that the FBI had, of course, received Reeves Morgan's telephone call. During the trial of Clay Shaw, the chief counsel for CIA, Lawrence Houston, worried that Shaw might talk. He checked to see if Shaw had signed a secrecy agreement with the agency, something hardly necessary if he were merely a businessman routinely, quote-unquote, being debriefed, as Garrison's detractors insist. Shaw had not. He kept his mouth shut anyway and lied at the trial. Were the Clinton and Jackson witnesses the only people who saw Oswald, Shaw, and Ferry together? No. The contractor who worked for Clay Shaw, supervising the renovations of his many French Quarter properties, is another witness who did not come forward. He had worked for Shaw for so many years that he had a key to the patio door of Shaw's house at 1313 Dauphine Street. He was accustomed to letting himself in when he had work to do. It was 12 noon, an hour when he would not expect to find Shaw at home during the summer of 1963. He let himself in through the patio door, only to discover in the large room that comprised the entire downstairs of Shaw's house, deep in conversation around a table, Shaw and Ferry and Lee Oswald. Usually Shaw made time to talk to him. This time, Shaw rose quickly to his feet and ushered the man out. "I'm engaged in a conference right now," Shaw said. Jim Garrison did receive information about this witness, but was not able to follow up. As if the witnesses at the Shaw trial from East Feliciana were not enough, Garrison began to develop another Jackson witness. Her name was Gladys Palmer, and she was seen by many witnesses with Oswald, as was another woman in Jackson named Gloria Wilson. Wilson's lover was so terrified and in fear of his life after the assassination that he begged Ann Dishler, Jim Garrison's investigator, not to mention his name to anyone. She has not done so. Gladys Palmer had been a stripper at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club, and when she returned from Texas to Jackson, she was in an automobile registered to Jack Ruby. This was verified by a deputy sheriff and a state trooper. There's a great deal of evidence, there's a lot of Louisiana evidence showing that Ruby and Oswald knew each other well, many, many witnesses. There is testimony that Clay Shaw knew Jack Ruby. And Thomas Edward Beckham told me he was shocked on the Sunday after the assassination when Oswald was murdered. How could Jack do that to Lee? He knew that Ruby and Oswald knew each other well. Let those who pretend that Jim Garrison did not have compelling evidence linking suspects connected to the CIA with the assassination ponder some of this. I want to mention one other important association of Oswald's. By now, many people have concluded that Oswald was associated with anti-Castro people and that his membership in Fair Play for Cuba was one of the many, quote, infiltrations Oswald undertook since his teenage years when he said he was infiltrating the New Orleans Astronomy Club. And I think, as we know, he was acting out that scenario that he enjoyed on his favorite television show, I Led Three Lives. One of Oswald's deepest New Orleans connections was with an anti-Castro Cuban who was also an employee of the International Trade Mart. and this man worked for a demonstrable CIA proprietary called All Transport, Inc. This man, like Oswald, was associated with U.S. Customs. His name was Juan Valdez, and Oswald visited him frequently at his apartment at the Patios apartment complex uptown. Valdez is on record as having found the body of an orthopedic surgeon who was murdered under bizarre circumstances. The victim was his neighbor and acquaintance, Mary Sherman. Mary Sherman worked for a CIA asset in New Orleans medical luminary Alton Ochsner, a close associate of Clay Shaw's. Jim Garrison discovered that Mary Sherman had contributed to the training camps north of Lake Pontchartrain where Oswald and Ferry were spotted, and I fully give credit to Robert Tannenbaum's testimony that he saw the film showing Oswald and Ferry there in that training camp. A small fire had been set in Sherman's apartment to disguise what really happened to her, a very bizarre burning away of the flesh of her body, which could not have been done by a fire. Valdez found her body, although he was not her immediate neighbor. At once, the police detectives on the case, who knew nothing of Ochsner and Shaw, made Valdez their chief suspect. Valdez, apparently protected by higher authority, was allowed to type his own statement at police headquarters. The police officers were prevented from giving him a polygraph about Mary Sherman by their superior, Lieutenant James Kruby, whom those who know the Garrison file will remember attempted at various points to obstruct Garrison's case. A witness who never came forward told me she knew Lee Oswald from Beauregard Junior High School. She lived next door to Juan Valdez and immediately recognized Lee Oswald when he came to her door and asked where Juan lived. She knew him as Harvey, by the way. Oswald would appear frequently with Juan to use her telephone to make calls to Cuba. Through the thin walls, she could hear them talking in Valdez's apartment, in the bathroom, flushing the toilet over and over, obviously destroying paper. Garrison subpoenaed Valdez, but then allowed him to be interviewed by one of those plants in his office named William Martin. Nowhere in Martin's report does he write about Valdez knowing Lee Harvey Oswald. It is one more quintessential moment of CIA obstruction of Jim Garrison's effort. Martin also did the questioning for Garrison of another CIA asset, as you know, maybe Richard Case Nagel. And Judge Thunheim told me last night that the ARRB had no luck in getting Nagel's records. When Martin left Garrison's office in December of 1967, he contacted the agency, and that document is available in the National Archives. What Garrison could not quite show was that it was the CIA which set up Oswald to take the responsibility for the assassination. I found a witness who could show me that. He was, along with Oswald and Kerry Thornley, among the low-level CIA employees commandeered for the assignment of killing the president. His name was Thomas Edward Beckham. He appeared before Garrison's grand jury where he admitted to me he did not tell the truth, it's obvious, and that he was threatened with death should he implicate his handler, Fred Lee Chrisman. He was emboldened to lie, like Shaw, like Thornley, like Lawrence Howard and Lorianne Hall and Juan Valdez, because he believed that the CIA would protect him. For all these people, that turned out to be true. Today, Beckham regrets that he did not tell Jim Garrison what he knew. Gordon Novell, an FBI informant who for a brief time infiltrated Jim Garrison's office, I think on behalf of Walter Sheridan for one thing, told me, how many Oswalds did they have out there ready to go? Thomas Edward Beckham was one of these people. It was Beckham who at Langley, Virginia, CIA set up to play the role of scapegoat should Oswald not work out. In New Orleans, his handler had been Jack Martin, and outside Louisiana, Chrisman, whom time does not permit me to discuss today. I was not the first person after Jim Garrison to interview Beckham. He was first interviewed by HSCA's Jonathan Blackmer and L.J. Delsa, and again by Delsa and Burris. And over the past 7 years, I've corroborated many of the statements Beckham made in these interviews. Uncertain, Delsa and Burris arranged that Beckham be given a polygraph by Richard Hunter of the New Orleans Police Department, a person they trusted. And these police officers, by the way, and I think Bob Tannenbaum, if you ask him, will, I'm sure say so, impeccable integrity and credentials. This polygraph was free of charge to the United States government. Beckham passed. Delsa and Burris concluded that Beckham, like Oswald, had been a young, uneducated kid grabbed up by intelligence. That another investigation controlled by the government would be propitious, you can ask yourself this question whether or not it would be, is reflected in what happened next. As another Garrison witness and CIA asset, Richard Case Nagel, said of the HSCA under Blakey and Gary Cornwell, nobody there really wants the truth. The Beckham material more than supports Nagel's conclusion. Instead of being grateful and enthusiastic about the development of this witness by Burris and Delsa, Gary Cornwell claimed that Burris had never requested permission to give Beckham a polygraph. Burris told Cornwell, and you can, if you knew Burris, you can see how fierce he can be. I looked you right in the eye and requested permission for the polygraph. Did I give you a specific reply? Cornwell said. A measure of how important a witness Beckham was emerges. Bobby, they're afraid of what the polygraph showed, Delsa said. Now Burris and Delsa would become scapegoats, and the polygraph treated as if it had been a mistake. Delsa and Burris were punished with 2-week suspensions. For good measure, Blackmer was also suspended. They were forbidden to investigate the role of Fred Lee Chrisman, who by then was dead, and they were never given another assignment, really, in the state of Louisiana. The New Orleans interviews were now conducted by Washington people, this is about HSCA, who did not know the terrain or when This was demonstrated in Lawrence Howard's appearances in East Feliciana Parish. Jonathan Blackmer went up to Baton Rouge and interviewed the Clinton witnesses again, and every time the name Lawrence Howard appeared or somebody said that they'd seen him up there, Blackmer changed the subject. When I found Beckham, he told me a great deal about how he had been groomed to take the role that Oswald finally played. Shaw and Ferry had prepared Oswald to take that role, but what if something went wrong? Beckham was one of those selected to take the fall for the crime. He presented me with a government document to substantiate his testimony. It had been given to him by Fred Lee Chrisman sometime after the assassination, and I have the original. You won't find it in the National Archives. Jack Martin had gotten Beckham that post office box along with the other CIA assets across from Bannister's office, and Beckham accompanied Martin to Bannister's office on the day that Martin stole the file that led to the pistol whipping you've seen in the movie JFK. One day, early in 1963, Beckham opened his post office box and found there an airline ticket to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, with instructions. At Langley, he was given tests, shown pictures projected on a screen, and then questioned about what he remembered and what stood out, such as a man's hat perched at an odd angle. If this sounds like the movie The Parallax View, the scene is corroborated by another CIA asset whom Garrison questioned, Loran Hall, in his HSCA testimony describing how he was trained by military intelligence in the same precise way. Beckham spent 4 weeks at Langley. He was taught how your voice can give you away. He was taught never to volunteer opinions, never to brag. He was very loquacious because he had not learned to read and write until he was an adult, so he was an extremely verbal person. He was taught how by the way you walk you can give you away. He was trained never to leave anything behind that people might remember you by. He was instructed how not to leave a paper trail. He was taught how to create fake identification. He was instructed in how to be an assassin. The official document that Chrisman handed to Beckham about himself notes that he is an expendable person, one of 5 sons. It reads, quote, has no personal feelings as to killing or death. See psychological report. It summarizes Beckham's training: hand-to-hand combat, special training, special firearms course, CIA field training, special mind search, IQ training. The document concludes, psychological data: subject gets upset with people and pulls away, drinks and smokes, parentheses, pipe, likes to study people. No psychological effect, I guess, as to guilt on killing. He was a man who did not mind killing and was selected accordingly. Lest you think this may be a forgery, I will quote a CIA report released by the Church Committee which describes the, quote, agent or asset rogue whom the agency had enlisted in its plan to murder Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. In this secret document, the chief of the agency's African division wrote, he is indeed aware of the precepts of right and wrong, but if he is given an assignment which may be morally wrong in the eyes of the world, but necessary because his case officer ordered him to carry it out, then it is right, and he will dutifully undertake appropriate action for its execution without pangs of conscience. In a word, he can rationalize all actions. The agency wanted men immune to guilt, and the same process by which CIA chose assassins to kill foreign leaders was utilized to execute the President of the United States. In the intervening years, several witnesses before Jim Garrison have told me they regretted not having told him what they knew. Donald P. Norton, another CIA employee, told me Jim Garrison was closer to the truth about the conspiracy than anybody has ever been. Beckham says of Garrison, he got it where it started and no one else came close.